Hello and welcome. I am Chip Griffin, the founder of SAGA, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am very happy to have with me someone today who can help talk about the future of work, particularly the future of work in agencies from both the employee perspective as well as from the employer perspective. So welcome to the show, Miles Everson, the CEO of MBO Partners.
Very good. Thanks, Chip. I'm glad to be here today as well. So this is an important topic for businesses throughout the United States. So
it's an absolutely vital topic, and almost every, frankly, business owner, let alone agency owner, is having conversations about this right now, trying to figure out, how are they going to reshape their team, reshape how they do work going forward? Are they, if they were in office full time before the pandemic, are they coming back entirely full time now? Is it going to be some hybrid thing, or are they just going to say, forget about it, I don't want to lease anymore, we're going to go all remote? There's so many factors that go into this, and it's not just about what you want to do, it's what's feasible within the environment, and how do you navigate all of the the pitfalls that are out there. And that's something that I think that you can speak to quite well. So before we jump into some of those topics, though, can you tell me a little bit more about yourself and MBO Partners?
yeah, I'm happy to. So I'll start with myself, which is I joined MBO 2 years ago as the CEO. Delighted to be here. Prior to that, I'd spent 30 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I last finished running the global advisory and consulting businesses, where obviously we had a lot of human capital and a lot of services and clients that we sold work to and helped create value. Here at MBO Partners, what we're doing is we're making it easy for independents. And when I say independents, it can be small businesses as well as individual solo entrepreneurs do work with very large companies. So I think of us as we are an enterprise gateway solution. We help enterprises make it possible for lots of people in their organization to do work with these independents. And so that's what the company's been around for 25 years. I'm delighted to be here, and we're doing our best to try to help make that work easier for the independents and the enterprises.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I think that's a great setting of the table for the conversation that we're going to have, because a lot of agencies are interested in hiring more independents for their teams. Historically, agencies, particularly small ones, have relied upon independents in order to supplement their teams and to develop the expertise they need. But we're in an environment now where it's becoming more challenging to do that. You've got some states like California that have really clamped down on the rules on how you can qualify as an independent contractor. You've got a lot of states who are, trying to do more in terms of tax grabs for any kind of presence that a business may have in their state. And so at the same time that owners are looking for flexibility, particularly coming out of the pandemic, they've got to figure out, how do I do this and not come across some tripwire that's going to increase my taxes or get me into trouble with some government agency. So is it first of all, is my characterization accurate? Is it more challenging from a regulatory and legal standpoint than it was, say, 10 years ago?
The piece of it that's more challenging regulatorily, in my view, is it's the worker classification regulations.
Right.
So, and so what you can have is still people are classified that they need to be an employee, but that's where they can be an employee of, for example, we have a payroll company, so we'll W-2 them so the agency doesn't have to. So from an agency perspective, you can have both 1099s and W-2 for worker classification and still be able to access a large pool of independent talent. And that's the value of what we're doing, or at least one of the big pieces of value.
Right. So basically what you're doing is you're taking away the headache of trying to figure out how to navigate all these different systems. And so it allows the agency owner to focus on the substance of the work, and you focus on the bureaucracy of the work, for lack of a better way of describing it.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's what we're doing.
So because of this, you're obviously working with a lot of employers, a lot of employees. Let's take a moment and pull out that crystal ball. And as you're looking into the future, what is the future of work looking like for agencies? What do you see coming down the pipeline that's important for agency owners to be considering as they're determining their own structures in the years ahead?
Yeah, well, let me start with just some kind of context. I'll say factual data points that are important. So, and these are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you work in the United States today and you're under 45 years old, you'll change companies every 4.1 years. If you're under 35, you'll change every 2.8 years. So I would actually, I think, could make a pretty good case that the velocity of a rotating workforce is happening in the full-time workforce as well. And so what that means from my perspective is every company or agency has to have, the muscle, if you will, to be able to deal with a higher velocity of change in their workforce than what they historically would have thought of. And then you kind of add to that what's happened, I think it's, the COVID pandemic effect is 46% of white collar workers say they're going to change jobs in the next 12 months. Mm-hmm. That's an astronomical turnover rate for any company. So I look at it and say, by definition, if you're going to be really accessing the best talent on the planet, you have to have multiple channels in terms of where you get that talent from. And an important channel is the independent worker, because more people today choose to be independent than are forced to be independent. Mm-hmm. And it's just such an important context to have. Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the challenges is that governments don't seem to recognize that a lot of workers want to be independents, right? They see being independent as a threat, and part of that's because some of the structure that's been built into the system, as far as tying a lot of social benefits to your actual employment, and we can have those debates, I suppose, another day. But because of that, it creates that tension where you've got workers who want that freedom, that independence, and yet government that sees that as a bad thing in the guise of trying to protect those workers.
Yeah, so this is actually a really important point, Chip. I think in the political circles, far too often, all independents are kind of painted with a single brush, if you will, saying they're gig workers, they're freelancers, they're independents. And I think there is a very demonstrable difference between somebody that is working as a temporary worker and is an unskilled laborer and is getting taken advantage of, if you will, by the big guy, versus people with college degrees that can earn six-figure incomes, high five-figure incomes, and can make those judgments for themselves. And so the regulation needs to get pointed towards what is the real objective that's trying to be done. Because I think most people would say we should make sure that there's some type of, rails of safety, if you will, for the little person that could get taken advantage of. But college-educated people can make their own choices as to what they want to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, one of the other things we're seeing from a freedom perspective, I know, is something that you're particularly passionate about looking at it, and that's the whole concept of the digital nomad. And so can you take a little bit of time just to explain what a digital nomad is and how that's going to change the nature of work? Yeah,
so first of all, digital nomad is somebody that is not only working remotely, but they're working remotely from multiple geographic locations. And so I'll start with, again, the COVID pandemic accelerated companies' willingness and ability to work with a remote workforce. Right? 15 months ago, there was hesitation to embrace a remote workforce for many, many companies. And then all of a sudden, they were 100% remote. So that accelerated what I believe was an inevitable change anyway. But it pushed a decade into a year in terms of duration. And so once you get to the point where you say, okay, it's okay for people to work remote, then the worker can start to choose where they want to spend their time and work. And so, if you look at what's happened between 2019 and 2020, so we don't have the 21 data yet, but there was a 49% increase in digital nomads. Again, a significant increase. So there's 10.9 million of them in the United States today that are that's their primary residence. Interestingly enough, 6.3 million of those are full-time workers. That is up 96% from 2019. So basically doubled because of COVID, right? And so, but when you look at it, and I think this points to a much deeper macro trend that existed before COVID was present, which is digital nomads. 90% of them have higher job satisfaction, and when it comes to income satisfaction, 76% say that they're satisfied with their income. So you think of a happy, secure workforce as part of what you want. And I think we're seeing that's coming to bear out as we see people that are choosing to work as these digital nomads.
Yeah, and the last year really did accelerate this, right? Some people, for a variety of reasons, chose to pick up and temporarily work from somewhere else. Maybe it's because, if you're going to be trapped at home, you'd rather be, trapped at home on a lake or an ocean or in a mountain area. Maybe you went to spend time with family because they needed some help in the evenings, and so you could work during the day and help out. There's all sorts of reasons that the people chose to do it over the last year, but what you're saying is that's not a blip, that's a trend that's going to continue.
Yeah, it's absolutely a trend. And one of the predictions that I have about the future, and I think it started already, Chip, which is the balance of power is going to accelerate towards the worker, in the power between a company and the worker. Because good work, one thing is there's scarcity of qualified workers in the hottest skill areas to begin with. But secondarily, when you have a liquid market, if you will, where demand and supply can find itself more easily, the best providers are they choose who they work for because they have a wide variety of choice. And that's definitely accelerating. And you see that amongst, entrepreneurial people that choose to go be independents.
Yeah, and right now I think we would both agree that it's a very talent friendly market, right? So there are a lot of agencies I know out there looking to hire, and they're having a very difficult time finding folks because people can be choosy right now, and so they're choosing to be choosy, if that makes sense. And our mutual friend Karen Swim has chimed in here with I think what's a good point, which is that flexibility creates satisfaction, and she says it's ridiculous that more companies don't understand this. And I do think that flexibility is something that frankly both sides can value in this equation, both the employer and the employee. I guess the question that I have when it comes to flexibility is if you're an employer and you say, look, I'm fine to have digital nomads. I don't care if they work remotely. I don't care where they're working from. I'm just looking for the quality of work. Is it enough to say that, or do you need to be considering other things when you're coming up with your own policies as an agency business?
Yeah, so this was the heart of a thought leadership piece that we put out last week in the Harvard Business Review, which addresses how companies need to think about digital nomadism. And a big piece of this is you need to know where your full-time employees are working. Because I think it's less of an issue for small agencies, just to be clear, okay? But for some large companies, in particular, you could end up with multiple people working in a jurisdiction, and they trigger tax residency obligations, and they're going to go to the company to collect those taxes, not the individual.
Right.
Because it's easier. It's the deep pockets approach. So
right.
that's what's going to happen. So having a policy and then making sure where people are physically working, as opposed to assuming they're working at the location that is their residence on file.
Right.
Right.
Well, and it's something that you need to work with your team to help educate them about too, right? Because I can imagine a lot of employees might say, sure, I live in New Hampshire or Florida where there's no income tax, and so I've got some address there, and so it's not really in my interest to tell my employer that I'm actually, working from Manhattan or Los Angeles or somewhere with a higher tax burden that's not going to just affect my employer, it's going to affect me too. So how do you navigate that and make sure that you're helping your employees be in compliance as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, awareness is an important point on this one, because I don't think, there's not a sufficient awareness, is what I'm saying, on the employees.
Absolutely.
And by some employers as well, of what the potential downside issues are. Now, I will say that, our belief is that the work style that fits into the lifestyle, back to this flexibility point that Karen was making a few minutes ago, that will outlast, if you will, the regulatory pressures and issues. People will learn how to deal with the regulations, they'll comply. And so I don't see the regulations as having sufficient power to change, what a very large mass of people want for their lifestyle and work style.
Right.
And so that's going to happen regardless. And, so when I think of this, if I go right back to the staffing agency, I think who, a lot of the listeners may be today, I think you got to get beyond thinking about this as a compliance matter and think about it as, how do I really optimize my total workforce? And that starts with really thinking of your workforce as being broader than your full-time employee base. Because I would argue that by definition, if you're not looking beyond your full-time workforce, there's no way you can have confidence that you're getting a look or access at all of the great talent that's out there and is available.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great point. I mean, at the end of the day, and I always tell my clients this, you can find a way to navigate whatever regulatory, tax, and legal structures exist around you, right? You need to figure out what is best for the business and then work with your professional partners of various kinds to make sure that you're, at least mitigating the risk. But it shouldn't be an obstacle in itself to doing what you want and what your team wants. But so now let's pivot a little bit to how you actually manage this as an employer. How do you get the most out of your team when when you've got people who are, you've got some digital nomads on your team, you've got, maybe some in-office people in your team, you've got people working different time zones, you've got, you've got a mix of full-time, part-time, and independent contractors. How do you do that as a manager and figure out how you get the most out of them? Does it change the nature of communications with your team?
It changes the nature of communications, touch on that, but it also changes, I believe, how companies think about the way they run their business. I'm saying from an operating model perspective. And I see us moving at a greater pace at going after a project outcome-based operating model versus an org chart-based operating model. So it's a bit of adopting, I'll say loosely, agile type concepts that have been used for systems development into how you think about value creation in your companies altogether, which is, I'm going to get the right deep niche skills that I need for a particular outcome I'm driving towards. I may not need those skills full-time all the time. And that's why you tap into the independent workforce to get the skills you need. But your internal, again, your organizational muscle that you need is not just how do I manage a bunch of people that report to me every day, regardless of what I have them doing, but how do I bring together teams? How can I form teams quickly? How do I get those squads or pods of people to produce very well? By the way, some leading companies have been doing this for years, and it makes you more agile and more nimble in doing that. And so I see that as a really important component of how you think about this going forward. And then now I forgot your first point, Chip. What was your first question?
So does it change the nature of communications with your team?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So one thing that COVID pandemic did is it made for a number of industries, health provider industry and for the education system, going from synchronous to asynchronous interactions. And so I think what we'll see for the next 5 to 10 years is even more asynchronous communications occurring. So think of it as anywhere where today you think it's got to be synchronous, you have to challenge yourself and say, well, why couldn't this be an asynchronous communication? And just to be clear, maybe synchronous is the interaction is happening at the same time, and asynchronous is it happens at different times. A great example would be interviewing people. You don't need to interview people synchronously. You can do asynchronous interviews. Because there's a fair bit of support out there now that asynchronous communications drive up productivity, drives up happiness, because it gives people more of the control of when they're interacting and with whom they're interacting. And so that's better than, having to do everything at the same time. So it's flexibility.
Yeah, and I think it's finding the right mode for the task at hand, right? Because there are some times where asynchronous can slow things down, right? Where if you and I were to spend 30 seconds just going back and forth, we could probably solve something just like that. But there are a lot of times, as you point out, where asynchronous can be much more convenient, because if I've got a kid crying, a dog barking, I've got to run an errand, I've got the flexibility as a worker to address that in a way that fits within everything else that's going on in my life, which makes me happier, more productive, and all that. So trying to find those mixes, I think, is something that a lot of organizations are going to have to continue to feel their way through in the years ahead, and probably some tools will have to continue to be developed in order to make some of these processes as smooth as possible.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, look at the profound effect that email and online collaboration tools have had, which most often that's asynchronous communication. I think what happens is some people try to use it as synchronous, and they get sucked into their keyboard for 8 hours a day, which is a little different. So I think the workforce and companies will have to get better at what means of communication are we using when, and for what purpose. And when done properly, it can drive up productivity of a workforce.
Yeah, and I think it is going to require a mindset shift on everyone's part to understand, what kind of tool you're using and is it right for the task, right? So, to me, texting is much more of a synchronous communication mode, right? Because there's not typically, it's one of the reasons why I discourage my clients from using it with me, because, it's hard to flag things for follow-up, you lose track of things, whereas email is great for asynchronous, because you can flag things, file things, organize things, and make sure they don't fall through the cracks. But trying to make sure that you're not using an asynchronous tool for synchronous or vice versa is a learned skill, and something that I think folks are going to have to spend some time with as well.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So if I'm if I'm sitting here as an employer with, let's say, maybe, a 20-person team, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, what does all this mean for me, though, right? You guys have talked about some great high-level concepts and things I should be thinking about, but realistically, is there anything that I should be going out and doing in the next, 6, 12, 18 months to make significant changes to my business? Should I only do it if I feel the need? I mean, talk to me a little bit about what your practical advice for that small employer is.
Yeah, so I think they need to be factoring in what kind of, this is from a strategic perspective, what percent or number of people do I want to be independents as a part of my total workforce? And I say this because if you wait until you need it, you're going to be behind the 8 ball, so to speak.
Right. Yep.
And, so there's a number of specific use cases. So when you have a strategy for embracing an independent workforce, you may have great talent that's a full-time employee, and they come to you and they say, I don't want to work full-time anymore. Mm-hmm. Well, it gives you an option to keep that person engaged as a potential independent to work periodically with you. Mm-hmm. Okay? Another use case is if there's really 46% turnover, you're going to spend all your time interviewing instead of having a pool of, virtual specialists, if you will, that you've built up that you have access to. So that's where we're spending a lot of our time now, is building virtual benches of talent for our enterprise clients that in their hot skills areas. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the other is, if you want the flexibility to lean into growth without incurring the upfront fixed cost of hiring people and putting them on the bench, so to speak, until you find work, having a pool of independents that are available to help you drive your growth agenda is a lot less expensive way to drive growth than relying on only a full-time workforce. I'm not saying that there's not a place for full-time workers. There absolutely is. But should you be targeting 25, 30% of your workforce or more, maybe even to be independents? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I personally think a good rule of thumb for agencies, given the nature of work, is you should have a percentage of your workforce as independents at least as large as your largest client is the percentage of your revenue. So if your
Sure.
largest client is a quarter of your revenue, then at least a quarter of your labor costs should be independents, because that gives you the flexibility should something really bad happen, to make more intelligent decisions. It doesn't mean you wouldn't have to do any layoffs in those cases, but at least you've got some portion of the workforce that's automatically more susceptible to being flexed, and it gives you that breathing space, if you will, to make more strategic decisions in those moments, as opposed to the panicked ones that so often I'm sure you and I have seen businesses make.
Look, that's part of the reason independents choose to be independents. The best independents will have 5, 6 clients that they work for regularly, and they view it as risk diversification.
Yep.
Because if one company has a problem, they have 5 or that they can go do work with. And I'm saying that's a risk mitigation strategy, but it's also obviously they get to choose who they work for and the type of work and projects that they work on. So it's back to, if you want access to great talent, you're going to have an independent strategy. By the way, most of these independents, because they're independent by choice, they are inherently more entrepreneurial. And so what's wrong with having some entrepreneurial spirit embedded in your workforce?
Yep.
I mean,
Well, it's not just entrepreneurial spirit, but one of the things I preach: communicators need to have more business acumen, and
Sure.
independents, simply because they have to do things like file business tax returns and set themselves up properly and those kinds of things. They start to develop, even if they don't want to, even if they're not inclined to, they have to start learning some of those basic business concepts that will serve them well as they're serving clients down the road.
Absolutely. Yep,
So,
I agree.
Miles, I mean, we've really just scratched the surface here. I suspect we could go on for 2 or 3 hours, but do you have anything that we didn't touch on that you think would people would benefit from hearing in this moment before we wrap up?
Yeah. So the first thing is I'm going to go back to the digital nomads, right? So we just did the recent research on this, and there's 64 million adults in the United States today that believe over the next 3 years they may become a digital nomad. Okay, that's a very significant number. And so I think you want to keep your eye on how you will deal with digital nomads in your workforce. And that's both full-time and independent. Okay, so the second is we see the number of independents over the next 5 years growing at 2.5 times the rate of the full-time workforce. So by 2025, well over 50% of the people in the United States will either be an independent or will have worked as an independent. And that's pretty profound. And then the third item I would highlight here is, in the independent workforce today, 16% of that workforce is made up of the Gen Zs, and the Gen Zs are predicted to be the most entrepreneurial group of workers that are coming into the workforce. And so what I'm pointing to here is, historically, the independent workforce had tended to be a bit older than the average age of the workforce in full-time. We're seeing a shift on that. And so if you're even thinking about how do you pipeline for the next 4 or 5 years, access to the right talent, again, if you want that generation of talent working with you, you're gonna have to embrace the independent workforce. They also change jobs every 2.8 years.
Right. Yeah. So a lot to think about here. If people would like more of your insights, or they'd like to learn more about MBO Partners, where can they get more information?
Yeah, well, they can go to MBO Partners website, which is on the screen here, which is mbopartners.com, and they can reach me directly at miles@mbopartners.com is my email. So I'd love to hear from folks. So thank you.
Well, Miles, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. You've shared a lot of valuable insights, things that people are thinking about today, and given a lot of food for thought. So I do appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody who tuned in either live or is listening now on the podcast feed. And I look forward to having you all back with me on a future episode.
Excellent. Thanks, Chip.